The phone call came at 11:14 p.m. on a Tuesday. Rain was lashing against the study windows of my home in Connecticut. I was reading a biography of Lincoln. The house was quiet. My wife had passed away 5 years prior, leaving me with the particular kind of silence that only widowers understand. I picked up the receiver. "Grandpa?" The voice was small, trembling. It was barely audible over the sound of heavy rain and passing highway traffic. "Lily?" I asked, sitting up straight. "Lily is my 9-year-old granddaughter, or more accurately, she is my son's adopted daughter. He and his wife had adopted her 4 years ago when they thought they couldn't conceive naturally. 2 years later, they had a biological son. Since then, Lily had been slowly, quietly erased from their family portraits. "Grandpa, I'm cold," she whispered. "Where are you?" "Lily?" My voice didn't rise. Panic is contagious, and a crying child needs anchor, not an echo. There's a sign that says Sunoco, off the highway. Dad told me to get out of the car." I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. "He told you to get out?" "He gave me my pink suitcase," she sobbed, the fear finally breaking through. "He said the new house in the gated neighborhood only had room for biological family. He told me to wait by the ice machine and call you. He said you'd know what to do. He left a 9-year-old girl at a highway gas station in the rain. He didn't drive her to my house. He didn't have the courage to look me in the eye. He just dropped her off like an unwanted piece of furniture that didn't match the decor of his new $2 million mansion. He thought he was being efficient, and he thought I was just a tired 70-year-old retired man who would quietly absorb his mess to avoid a family scandal. He forgot what I did for a living before I retired. I spent 35 years as a federal judge specializing in probate, family estate law, and trust enforcements. I spent 3 decades legally dismantling wealthy people who thought the rules didn't apply to them. "Listen to me, Lily," I said. My voice was absolute steel. "Stay inside the store. Stand next to the cashier. Do not talk to anyone else. I am leaving right now." I hung up the phone. I didn't scream. I didn't throw the phone at the wall. Anger is a waste of cardiovascular energy. I stood up, put on my wool coat, and picked up my car keys. My son David had just made the biggest calculation error of his life. He thought he was discarding a burden. He didn't realize he had just handed me the legal leverage to destroy his entire existence. I drive a remarkably well-maintained 2015 Volvo sedan. It is a safe, boring car. It projects stability and a fixed income. It doesn't project the fact that a retired federal judge has a pension and investment portfolio that dwarfs the gross revenue of my son's boutique marketing agency. I drove 20 miles down Interstate 95 in driving rain. My pulse never went above 70 beats per minute. True power is not a raised voice. It is not a tantrum. It is the absolute chilling certainty of consequence. I found Lily sitting on her small pink suitcase inside the brightly lit Sunoco station. She was shivering. Her coat was soaked. A teenage cashier was looking at her nervously, unsure of what to do. When Lily saw me, she ran across the linoleum floor and buried her face in my wool coat. "I'm here," I said quietly, resting my hand on her head. "I have you." I looked at the cashier. "Thank you for letting her stay inside." "Is everything okay, sir?" the kid asked. "Should I call the police?" "No," I said. "That won't be necessary." The police handle immediate danger. The police issue fines and court dates. Call the police and David gets a lawyer, claims it was a misunderstanding, gets a slap on the wrist for endangerment, and the bureaucracy takes over. I wasn't interested in a slap on the wrist. I was interested in absolute demolition. I took Lily out to the Volvo. I turned the heater on high. I wrapped her in a wool blanket I kept in the trunk. She stared out the window at the rain, clutching her seatbelt. "Why didn't they want me to come to the new house?" she asked softly. "Because," I said, keeping my eyes on the wet road, Your father's a man who measures value by appearance, not by character. And that is a disease that always cures itself eventually. My name is Robert Sterling. I'm 71 years old. I don't use social media. I don't care about neighborhood gossip. During my time on the federal bench, I seized estates from corrupt hedge fund managers and froze the assets of international smugglers. I know how to freeze a man's life so completely he can't buy a loaf of bread without asking my permission. When we got back to my house in Connecticut, I made Lily hot chocolate. I set up the guest room for her. I waited until she finally fell asleep, exhausted from the trauma of abandonment. Then I went into my study. I unlocked the bottom drawer of my mahogany desk. I pulled out a fresh legal pad and my gold-plated fountain pen, a retirement gift from the Federal Appellate Circuit. I wrote down David's name. Underneath it, I wrote his wife's name, Vanessa. Underneath that, I wrote, The Sterling Generation Skipping Trust. Clause 4, Section B. David thought he bought his new mansion with his own brilliance. He was wrong. He was arrogant, but more dangerously, he was financially illiterate. The cage was already built. He had just locked himself inside it. You don't abandon a child overnight. The rot always shows itself early if you know how to look for it. 2 weeks ago, David and Vanessa invited me to dinner at a high-end French restaurant downtown. It was a celebration. They had just closed on a massive property in a gated community called the Enclave. 6 bedrooms, Dad, David had said, swirling a glass of Cabernet. He wore a tailored suit from a designer I didn't care to recognize. Vaulted ceilings, a heated infinity pool. We're finally moving into the tier we deserve. Vanessa, wearing a diamond tennis bracelet that caught the restaurant lighting, nodded enthusiastically. The school district is incredible. Tyler is going to love it. Tyler was their biological son. He was 3 years old. And Lily? I asked, cutting my steak. How does she feel about the move? The temperature at the table dropped instantly. It always did when I mentioned Lily. David cleared his throat. He looked at his plate. Well, that's actually something we wanted to talk to you about. We're looking into alternative arrangements. I stopped cutting my meat. I looked at him. Alternative arrangements for a 9-year-old girl? I asked softly. She has behavioral issues, Robert, Vanessa interjected quickly. She doesn't bond with Tyler. She's not a true fit for our family dynamic. It's causing stress on the marriage. She is 9, I said. My voice was perfectly flat. She's not a rescue dog you return to the shelter because she sheds on the sofa. You don't understand modern parenting, Dad, David sighed, swiping his hand in a dismissive gesture. And he actually rolled his eyes. You're from a different era. Everything had to be duty and suffering for you. We deserve peace in our own home. He checked his Apple Watch. He was dismissing the conversation. He was dismissing me. Besides, David smiled, leaning back, the deed is signed. We used the family trust distribution to cover the down payment, cash, completely unleveraged. The house is ours. I didn't say anything. He didn't read the trust documents. I set up the Sterling Family Trust 10 years ago. It was a generation-skipping vehicle designed to protect wealth from estate taxes. But because I spent 30 years watching greedy heirs tear each other apart, I wrote very specific, ironclad clauses into the foundational charter, Clause 4. But Section B. Any capital distribution drawn from this trust for the purchase of primary real estate is legally contingent upon the unified maintenance of all legal dependents. The exclusion, abandonment, or legal separation of any listed dependent immediately classifies the capital draw as an unauthorized fraudulent conversion. David told me not to worry about modern parenting. He should have been worried about federal trust law. At the end of the dinner, he had patted my shoulder patronizingly. Don't stress your heart, Dad. Enjoy your retirement. Let us handle the heavy lifting of building the family legacy. The family legacy. I looked at the notes on my legal pad. I drew a single thick red line through the words David Sterling LLC. The disrespect was over. The audit had begun. The next morning at 8 a.m. sharp, I called my former clerk, Thomas. Thomas was now a senior partner at the most ruthless corporate litigation firm in Manhattan. He owed his entire career trajectory to my mentorship. When he saw my personal cell number on his caller ID, he answered on the first ring. "Judge Sterling," he said respectfully. "Good morning, Thomas," I said. "I need an expedited favor, off the ledger." "Name it." "I need the deed, the title history, and the complete financial wiring logs for a property just purchased in the enclave. Buyer name is David Sterling, and I need a draft of an emergency asset freeze under federal trust violations." There was a brief pause. Thomas wasn't an idiot. He knew David was my son. "A freeze on your own son's assets, sir." "Total," I said. "Accounts, credit lines, holding companies. If it has his name on it, I want it buried under an injunction so thick he can't buy a cup of coffee. He used the Sterling Family Trust to buy the house while simultaneously abandoning a listed dependent." Thomas actually let out a low whistle. "He abandoned a minor. That triggers a clawback clause. The entire purchase price becomes a defaulted loan instantly." "Yes," I said. "It does." By 1 p.m., a courier arrived at my door with a sealed envelope. I sat at my mahogany desk and reviewed the paperwork. It was worse than I thought. David hadn't just used the trust for the down payment, he had used it to completely backstop his failing marketing agency. He was legally insolvent. The new mansion was a facade, a hollow shell paid for entirely by money he had stolen from Lily's future in the trust. And he had abandoned her at a gas station to pursue a biological fantasy life he couldn't even afford. At 3 p.m., I drove to the local police precinct. I didn't go to the front desk. I went straight to the detective bureau on the second floor. The captain in charge, a man named Harris, had testified in my courtroom a dozen times over the years. "Judge," Harris said, standing up quickly when I walked in, "it's an honor. What brings you out of retirement?" I sat down in the steel chair across from him. "I need to report a Class B felony," I said evenly. "Child abandonment and endangerment of a minor." Harris frowned, pulling out a notepad. "Who's the victim?" "My granddaughter, Lily Sterling, 9 years old." His pen stopped. "And the suspect?" "Her legal adoptive father, David Sterling." Harris looked at me. Well, he understood exactly what was happening. A retired federal judge was walking into a precinct to put his own blood in handcuffs. The gravity of it silenced the room. "Judge," Harris asked softly, "are you sure you want to open this door?" "The door's already open, Captain," I said. My voice was ice. "Last night he left her at a Sunoco gas station off Interstate 95 with a pink suitcase. She is safe at my home now. But I want the report filed. I don't want an arrest made yet. I want the investigation opened, the security tapes from the gas station pulled, and the warrant held in your desk drawer until I tell you to execute it." Harris nodded slowly. "Building a cage?" "Yes," I said. By Thursday, the trap was fully armed. David and Vanessa were hosting a massive housewarming and networking party at their new mansion on Friday night. According to the social media posts my clerk had forwarded me, David had invited investors, local politicians, and half the country club. He was trying to project an image of untouchable wealth. He had absolutely no idea that his accounts were currently bleeding out. At 4 p.m. on Friday, I called the primary holding bank managing the Sterling Trust. I spoke directly to the chief compliance officer. "Execute the clawback protocol," I instructed. "Judge Sterling, are you certain?" the officer asked nervously. "Once we trigger a fraud conversion on a real estate holding, the title insurance collapses. The local municipality will be notified of the default. His operational business accounts will automatically lock within 2 hours." "Execute it," I said. I hung up the phone. I walked upstairs. Lily was sitting on the floor of the guest room, drawing in a notebook. She looked peaceful, but the shadow of rejection was still in her eyes. You don't erase that kind of trauma in 3 days, but you can start balancing the scale's geometry. Lily, I said gently. She looked up. I have to go out for a little while tonight, I told her. Mrs. Higgins from next door is going to come over and bake cookies with you while I'm gone. Are you going to see Dad? She asked. Her intuition was razor sharp. I stepped into the room. I knelt down so I was exactly at her eye level. I'm going to see David, I corrected her. A dad is a man who protects you. David is just a man who signed a piece of paper. Yet you and I are going to build a new life here, and he is never going to hurt you or anyone else ever again. She put her crayon down. She didn't look scared. She looked at me with the absolute, unshakable trust that a child gives to the only solid object in a collapsing room. Okay, Grandpa, she said. I stood up. I went to my bedroom and put on a suit. I didn't choose the tweed jacket I wore to the garden center. I chose the tailored navy blue wool suit I used to wear when I handed down federal indictments. Some suits carry a physical weight. Some suits smell like judgment. I picked up the thick leather folder containing the bank freezing orders, the trust clawback execution, and the draft arrest warrant for child abandonment. Outside, the sun was beginning to set. David was opening expensive champagne. Yet he was greeting guests in his foyer. He was smiling, believing he had successfully discarded his adopted daughter and secured his fake empire. I walked out to the Volvo. The engine turned over with a quiet, reliable hum. It was time to crash the party. The Enclave was a neighborhood built entirely on the illusion of old money. The security gates were wrought iron. The driveways were paved with imported European cobblestone. It was the kind of place where people hired professional landscape architects to make their lawns look effortlessly natural. I parked the Volvo down the street from David's new address. The mansion was massive, 6,000 square feet of stone and glass lit up like a movie premiere. Expensive cars, Porsches, Range Rovers, a few Mercedes were parked in a long line up the driveway. I turned off the ignition. I sat in the silence of the car for 2 minutes. I regulated my breathing. I cleared my mind of emotion. If you want to break a man who operates on arrogance, you cannot let him use your anger as a shield. You must be an absolute vacuum. I picked up the heavy leather folder and stepped out into the crisp evening air. I walked up the long driveway. The front door was wide open. A string quartet was playing classical music in the grand foyer. Waiters in white coats circulated with trays of champagne and caviar. I stepped inside. No one stopped me. No one noticed the 71-year-old man in the tailored navy suit standing silently by the marble columns. I watched David. He was standing in the center of the living room, holding a glass of scotch. He was surrounded by 4 men and 3 women, likely his private investors and top clients. He was laughing loudly. The secret to growth is cutting dead weight, David told his circle, his voice carrying over the music. You have to streamline your assets. You keep what adds value to the brand, and you pivot away from what slows you down. He took a sip of his scotch. He was talking about his business, but I knew exactly what else he had streamlined. Vanessa was standing near the fireplace, showing off her diamond bracelet to a group of wives. Tyler, their biological son, was running around the room in a miniature tuxedo, drawing awes from the guests. It was a perfectly staged, synthetic portrait of a successful American family. I let them enjoy it for exactly 3 more minutes. Then, I walked toward the center of the room. I didn't push through the crowd. Men with quiet power don't push. They simply move forward, and the crowd subconsciously steps aside for them. I stopped 5 feet from David. He didn't see me at first. He was too busy telling a story about his golf handicap. But the investors he was speaking to saw me. They naturally read my posture. They stopped smiling. David noticed their gaze shift. He turned around. When he saw me, the smile slid off his face. It didn't disappear entirely. It just froze into a brittle synthetic mask. "Dad," he said. His tone was a mixture of supreme annoyance and forced politeness. I didn't realize you were coming. Didn't you say you were busy with your schedule tonight? My schedule cleared up, I said. My voice was not loud, but it had the acoustic density of a gavel hitting wood. The string quartet suddenly sounded very far away. Well, David forced a laugh, turning to his investors. This is my father, Robert. He's retired. Probably just wanted to see what a real housewarming looks like, right? I wanted to see the house, I agreed. I looked up at the vaulted ceiling. Then I looked back at him. Before the bank repossesses it. The conversation in the immediate circle died instantly. One of the investors, a tall man with silver hair and a sharp suit, frowned. Repossesses it? David, I thought you said this property was purchased unleveraged. David flushed red. The vein in his neck tightened. It is, David said quickly. He stepped toward me, lowering his voice to an aggressive hiss. Dad, what are you doing? Have you lost your mind? Get out into the hall right now. He reached for my arm. I didn't flinch. I just looked at his hand until he slowly pulled it back. I have not lost my mind, I said. My voice carried clearly. The surrounding guests had stopped talking. The silence was spreading outward from our circle like a physical wave. But you have lost your liquidity. Vanessa pushed her way through the crowd. Robert, what's going on here? I didn't look at her. I opened the thick leather folder. I pulled out the emergency injunction document and handed it to the tall investor. My name is Robert Sterling, I said to the man. I am a retired federal judge specializing in trust law. What you are holding is a verified federal asset freeze. David went pale. Don't look at that. Give that back to him. He tried to snatch the paper, but the investor pulled it away, putting on his reading glasses. The Sterling Family Trust, I announced to the room, provided the capital for this home. However, under Clause 4, Section B, those funds are strictly contingent upon the legal maintenance of all listed dependents. I turned to David. His eyes were wide with rising panic. You used my trust to buy this house, I said, and then, to fit into it, you abandoned a 9-year-old adopted child at a Sunoco gas station in the rain. There was an audible gasp from one of the women near the fireplace. That's a lie, David yelled. His control was gone. The sophisticated CEO mask had shattered. She was acting out. We were sending her to a specialized facility. Dad, you're senile. She is asleep in my guest bedroom, I said coldly. And I have the security camera footage from the Sunoco station. I pulled out the second sheet of paper. Because you abandoned a legal dependent in a Class B endangerment scenario, the trust capital you used is retroactively classified as fraudulent conversion. 30 minutes ago, the holding bank executed a total clawback. Clawback? Vanessa whispered, her face completely white. David, what does he mean? It means, I said, finally looking at her, that as of 4 p.m. today, this house belongs to the bank. Your husband's operational accounts are frozen. His credit cards will decline. The catered food you are eating is currently unpaid for. The tall investor lowered the document. He looked at David like he was looking at a decaying piece of fruit on a sidewalk. You committed fraud on a family trust? The investor asked quietly. To buy a house you couldn't afford? Frank, please, it's a family dispute. We can fix this by Monday, David pleaded, his hands shaking. And you left a kid at a gas station? Frank continued, his voice turning hard. My sister is an adoption counselor, David. You're a monster, and you're completely insolvent. Our term sheet is dead. Frank tossed the injunction paper onto a marble side table. He didn't say goodbye. He just buttoned his jacket and walked toward the front door. His departure was the signal. When absolute financial ruin is announced at a high society party, nobody stays to finish their champagne. Wealthy people fear poverty like an infectious disease. Within 3 minutes, the grand foyer was a stampede of polite, urgent exits. The string quartet nervously packed up their instruments and slipped out the back. Soon, The massive 6,000 square foot living room was empty, save for me, David, and Vanessa. Vanessa was staring at her husband. The diamond bracelet on her wrist suddenly looked like heavy, ridiculous iron. "David," she said, her voice cracked. "Tell me he's lying. Tell me the accounts aren't frozen. My car payment, Tyler's private preschool tuition." "Shut up, Vanessa," David screamed. He lunged at me, not to hit me, but to grab the leather folder. I didn't move. I simply raised a single finger, pointing it directly at his chest. "Take another step," I warned, "and I will add assault of a former federal officer to your indictment." He froze. He was breathing heavily. His tailored suit was wrinkled. He looked incredibly small inside the massive cavern of his stolen living room. "Why?" he whispered, tears of sheer panic welling in his eyes. "I'm your son. You destroyed my company. You destroyed my life. Over a kid who isn't even blood?" "Blood," I said, "is a biological accident. Loyalty is a choice. You chose to be a coward. I chose to be a judge." "I'll fight the clawback," he sneered, trying to summon a final shred of defiance. "I'll hire lawyers. I'll tie you up in probate court for 10 years. "You don't have enough liquid cash to hire a traffic lawyer, David," I said. I closed the leather folder. The sound was sharp, final. "And you aren't going to probate court," I added. I looked through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows facing the driveway. 2 dark blue police cruisers had just pulled past the security gates. Their light bars weren't flashing. They didn't need sirens for an execution. They simply pulled up to the front doors and shifted into park. "You're going to criminal court." Captain Harris and 2 uniformed officers walked into the living room. They didn't ask questions. They already had the warrant. David didn't struggle when they put the handcuffs on him. He just stared at the marble floor in absolute shock. He couldn't comprehend how his meticulously curated fake life had been completely erased in a span of 45 minutes. Vanessa didn't comfort him. She was already crying on the phone with her divorce attorney, trying to figure out how to shield her own personal bank accounts from the federal freeze. The enclave got the scandal it deserved. The neighbors watched from their windows as the CEO was loaded into the back of a police cruiser in his tailored suit. I didn't watch the police car drive away. I had no emotional interest in his ride to the precinct. I walked to my Volvo, got in, and drove back to Connecticut. It took 3 months for the legal dust to settle. David pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of child endangerment to avoid a lengthy trial. Because his financial life was entirely frozen by my trust clawback, he couldn't afford private defense. He took a 2-year sentence in a state facility, followed by 5 years of probation. Vanessa filed for bankruptcy. The bank seized the mansion in the enclave, sold it at auction, and returned the trust capital to my accounts. I gained full, permanent legal custody of Lily. One evening in late November, the first heavy snow of the year was falling. The fireplace in my study was burning quietly. I was sitting at my desk, reviewing some old files. Lily walked into the room. She was carrying a book. She had gained weight. The shadows under her eyes were gone. She looked like a child again, unburdened by the anxiety of living with people who saw her as a defect. She sat in the leather chair across from my desk. She opened her book, but then she looked up at me. "Grandpa?" "Yes, Lily." "Mrs. Higgins said David went to a place where he can't leave for a long time." I put my pen down. "Children deserve the truth, delivered without malice and without sugarcoating." "Yes," I said. "He went to prison." She thought about that for a long time. The fire crackled in the hearth. "Did he go to prison because he didn't love me?" she asked. It was the most heartbreaking question a child could ask, but it was the question that required the most vital answer. "No," I said quietly, looking directly into her eyes. "He didn't go to prison because he didn't love you. He went to prison because he loved himself more than the rules of being a decent man. He broke a promise. And in this house, we do not let broken promises go unanswered." Lily nodded slowly. That was all the moral closure she needed. She didn't blame herself anymore. She understood that the failure belonged entirely to him, and the justice belonged entirely to the architecture of the law. "Okay," she said. She opened her book and started reading. The following spring, I stood in the driveway watching Lily ride a bicycle. She laughed as she coasted down the slight incline, the wind catching her hair. She was safe. She was legally untouchable. The trust had been restructured to ensure that upon my death, every red cent would bypass David entirely and fund her education and her future. David called me once from the state facility. He tried to use the old tricks. He tried to sound like the victim. He tried to ask for commissary money, attempting to leverage whatever fatherly instinct he assumed I still harbored. I didn't argue with him. I didn't yell at him for what he had done. I simply held the phone to my ear, listening to the desperate, hollow sound of a man who had built his empire on sand and was furious at the ocean for doing what the ocean does. "Why, Dad?" he pleaded into the receiver. "Are you even there? Are you listening to me?" "I am here," I said. "Then help me," he begged. "You're a judge. You know people. You can make some calls. You can get me out of this." I looked out the window at Lily, who was picking dandelions in the grass. "I already made my calls, David," I said gently. I hung up the phone. I didn't answer it when it rang again. Revenge is often depicted as a fiery, explosive thing, a loud collision. But true revenge, the kind that rearranges the world permanently, is incredibly quiet. It is the sound of a pen signing a document. It is the sound of a bank freezing an account. It is the sound of a heavy door locking behind a man who thought he could throw away a child and simply walk into his new mansion. I am not a monster. I am simply an auditor. And the ledger was balanced.